Okay, jump into the questions here. Can you tell us the backstory of the work and family course at Stanford and how that ultimately led to this book?
Sure. So I co-wrote the book with Professor Myra Strober. She's a labor economist and was actually the first female professor to get tenure at Stanford Business School. She went to the school in 1972 to start teaching there. And she, as one of the only women getting a PhD at MIT before that in economics and navigating different universities, had faced a fair amount of, let's say, uh, work and family challenges in her own life. The previous university where she taught did offered her a lecturer track role instead of a tenure track position, which they had offered to her male colleagues who graduated from the same program that she did. And when she went to ask why, they said, "It's because you live in Palo Alto." And she sort of scratched her head. They were in Berkeley, and she said, "I don't really get that." Well, it turned out they were really saying, "You have two young kids. We don't really know what's going to happen to you." And so she decided to teach a course based on her own experience. And it was called at first Women and Work. And it was an interdisciplinary course because there was no such thing as feminist economics. She was a pioneer in that field. And eventually, when she switched over to teach at Stanford, she started teaching to anyone who would come. And one day, one of the years, an intrepid man took the course and he said, you would attract a broader range of students if you called it something more inclusive. I'm a man and I find these topics really important for me. And so she changed the name to Work and Family. And that is what it was called when I took the course in 2008. And I took it with my then boyfriend at the time. We were both second year MBA students trying to decide if we would live together after we graduated, how we would navigate that. And we ended up writing our final paper on all of the life decisions that we would need to make together and how we would um, do that with all the information that was shared in the course. And we graduated, fast forward, we had several kids, we navigated career changes, we dealt with our aging parents. And when my co-author retired in 2018, she said, I really want to write a book about the course. And I said, you should. It has helped us so much. Ross and I, my husband and I, had been guest speakers in her class for many years. And then when we had lunch about a year later and I asked her how the book was going, she told me she hadn't written a word.
Hmm.
And so I said, oh, well, maybe you need an accountability partner. Because at the time I was an executive at Gap Inc. I had helped to start the first employee resource group for working parents at the company. And I did that with a working dad on the legal team. And I knew how important a partner was for a big project. And she looked at me and said, actually, I need more than that. I need a co-author. And you have been navigating all of these lessons in the trenches for the past decade. Would you write this book with me? And
Hmm.
I immediately said yes, jumped at the chance, thereby violating every rule in our book, which is don't make big life decisions in an instant. But we had known each other for over a decade. She was a mentor of mine, and I knew it would be a fruitful collaboration, and it really has.
Very
Wow,
cool.
it's an amazing story. Can you talk about the challenges with making holistic decisions that optimize for the long run?
Yeah, well, we have a lot of human biases that have kept us alive, evolutionarily. And so one of those biases is that we're very wired for the short term and we're very wired to see all of the negative consequences of our decisions. And when we're often making decisions, we are in a state of stress. Our emotions are high. We might have anger or fear or guilt or some other emotion that is preventing us from really accessing system two thinking that Daniel Kahneman talks about. Our system one is kind of emotional, very quick for us to access. It's frankly what we use to navigate all the decisions that we make that we don't even realize we're making every day. But when it comes to bigger decisions, decisions where money and love are on the line, which is most of the big ones that we make in life in terms of, do I marry this person? Do we want kids? Where should we live? Is this still the right person for me, right? Many years into a marriage, um, divorce, elder care, et cetera. We need to find a way to trick our brains to overcome those human biases and move from system one to system two thinking. And so that the challenge is getting yourself out of that emotional state into a more rational, logical, deliberate state. And that is really tricky for us humans. And this is one of the reasons we developed a framework in our book for how to think through big life decisions, because the conventional wisdom is that you should really separate decisions about money, financial decisions, career decisions, from decisions about love, right? We've all heard that adage of like, don't mix money and love, really separate those two, make romantic decisions with your heart. Well, the truth is that every big life decision has a component of money and a component of love in it. And so by separating them, you are doing yourself a disservice and are more likely to make a decision that you regret.
Let's go there. Let's go to can you talk about the 5 C's in your decision-making framework?
Sure. Yeah. So as you mentioned, we call ours the 5 C's, and it starts with clarifying what's important to you. That's really about knowing your core values, tuning out all of the other voices you might hear, trying to influence you to tell you what you want, society, your parents, etc. It's really getting the inside view in Daniel Kahneman's terms. Then you move to communicate, the second C, with those most affected by the decision. And clarify and communicate go together because you clarify what's important to you, you communicate, say with your partner, you hear what's important to them. It might cause you to change your mind. So then you move to the third C, which is to consider a broad range of choices. Now you're starting to get the outside view, and part of making a better decision is expanding your consideration set. You're trying to get away from the binary thinking that many of us get into when we're in these places of high stress. Do I quit my job or go for the promotion? Do we renovate our house or do we move to find a bigger one? But there's many places in between that might actually be better solutions. One of the ways you could access those creative choices is by the fourth C, which is to check in with trusted resources. These might be people who have faced the decision before. These might be even published studies that can give you insight, but some way to start to get the outside view and to introduce more creative choices than you see for yourself. And then the final C, the fifth C, is to explore likely consequences on broad time horizons. So not just the short term that we're all wired for, but also medium and long term. And not only the negative consequences, which again, as we humans tend toward the negative, we see more clearly, but also some of the positive consequences. This is a forecasting exercise. And so the 5 C's are iterative. I just went through them linearly, but you might learn something as part of one step that causes you to re-clarify, and then you will go through the process again. And so that is the tool in a nutshell.
What are some of the big conversations that couples should have early on?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I am definitely aware of all the conversations I didn't have in previous relationships before I started dating my current husband and was forced by nature of the class to have those big conversations. Because sometimes when we like someone and we think it's going well, we don't want to rock the boat, right? We don't want to introduce a weighty topic that we think might scare someone off, or we might find out that we're not on the same page. But the truth is, if you're going to find that out eventually, better find it out early on so that you can either decide that you can agree to disagree, or that you realize, oh, wow, this isn't going to work out because we have some pretty fundamental disagreements. So, the 4 topics I say are really important are, number 1, money. So that is a topic that it is so taboo to talk about still, although it's getting less taboo, certainly, than in my parents' generation, for sure. But, spending and saving habits. Do you have debt? What is your approach to investing? These are just philosophical questions that we have different points of view on. And also we have money stories based on how we were raised, based on what we saw our parents do and not do, that are informing our money. The second topic is, and these are all interrelated, so you'll see as I go through them. The second is career aspirations. You might meet someone when you're in one profession, but you might know that down the road you want to do something else. And so to make sure that you're sharing those career aspirations, particularly when it comes to the second topic or the third topic, which is children. Do you want them? How many? When? What are you willing to do if you cannot conceive naturally? These are important topics to just get someone's view on. And then, the fourth is really the the subject is home, and it can go in, different directions. Where do you live? Where do you want to live? How would you decide when to move? What does home mean to you? Does that mean somewhere close to your family? You might meet someone when you're not living close to your family, but eventually you want to move back to your hometown, all the way to, how you imagine sharing household chores. And these are topics that it's funny. I just did an event with a divorce attorney, and she was saying that so many of these topics are the ones that ultimately lead to divorce when people realize they're not on the same page. And so getting those topics and your feelings about them out early on is so critical, because then you start to build the muscle of being able to have uncomfortable conversations. And I liken it to weightlifting, right? The first time you lift a weight, it's uncomfortable. You might be sore the next day. It's not a fun experience necessarily, but if you keep up and you continue to do the reps, you adjust, you build the muscle, and you find yourself stronger as a result.
So you mentioned that you and your now husband went through those questions because you were in that class together. How would you suggest that, like a typical couple who are just dating, how do they broach those topics?
Well, every chapter of our book, which is organized by each of the life decisions we tend to encounter, in roughly the order that people encounter them, has exercises. So I like to say, blame the book. You might not be able to take the class, but you can certainly, say, oh, I heard this author on Rational Reminder, and there are these questions. I realize we've never talked about them. But as a couple who's just starting out, I think the money question is really well approached in the context of something that makes sense. So before you go on a trip together, that's a perfect time to say, we haven't talked about our budget for this trip. And one thing I want to share is that I'm still paying off some educational loans. And so that means that, my budget for our accommodations is X, and I'm hoping we can stay within that. But it made me realize, we haven't really talked about money. Like, how do you think about your budget? And it's a way in that feels more natural and is not so forced. And it starts to bring it up in small ways that then build up to some of those bigger topics. You don't need to pull out your credit report on a first date or, start to show somebody your paycheck, but you can introduce it in lower risk ways and start to model revealing things that you might not reveal otherwise.
Can you do like a deeper dive on how important it is to discuss how you're going to handle finances as a couple?
Yeah, I mean, there is research that says that couples who talk about money weekly, 78% of those couples say that they're happy, compared to 50% of couples who say they never discuss finances. So it's actually a recipe for happiness. I mean, it's because it's about getting on the same page and building that trust and the transparency. So I think it's really crucial. One of the things that we did as part of the course was talk about how to combine our finances. So my husband was going to accept a job in finance at a hedge fund. I was going to work in the nonprofit space. And we were making radically different salaries after business school. And one of the questions we broached was, how should we contribute towards our rent? Is it fair for us to pay the same amount, split it down the middle, or should we contribute a percentage of our salary? How do we want to pool our finances? Should we pool everything, pool only a little, partial pooling, or do we want to manage that independently and just send each other Venmos for, requests for things like rent? And I think Venmo didn't exist at the time, but you get the idea. So we had, we looked at actually a variety of couples and how they managed their different finances, and the arrangement that worked with that we decided to go with, which actually is what the research says is the best practice, is to pool some of our funds, but not everything. And what we did was, when we moved in together, we set up a joint account that we contributed to based on a percentage of our salary. We then upped the percentage when we got engaged, and then upped the percentage of our contribution again when we got married. So as we built trust, as we deepened our relationship, we had more at stake as a unit. And yet we maintained our separate independent accounts to be able to do things like buy each other gifts, take vacations that the other one didn't go on, have some financial independence, so that it's the phrase that Scott Rick uses, who I know has been a guest on this podcast, is financial translucency. And I think that is the approach that the research says really leads to the best outcomes.
Yeah, it's That's really interesting. So that's like it's like a progressive pooling of finances as you build
Yes.
trust over time.
Exactly. And I remember we were reminiscing about when we first set up our joint account, we said, and we've been now been married 15 years, together for 18. We said, okay, if we spend more than $100, we need to check with the other person. And now, you go grocery shopping and, that's immediately $100 right there, right?
Yeah.
So the times have changed and our trust has deepened, and so our flag amount for when we have to check in with the other person has increased as well.
I'm curious, how important is the division of housework in a relationship?
It is so important. I mean, it's one of these things where it's very easy to fall into a habit or a pattern that is not a conscious choice, but it's like, okay, well, you work from home, so it's easier for you to meet people, repair people when they come in during the day. So suddenly the person who works from home has all of these responsibilities that they didn't sign up for, but by nature of them being there, it's somewhat more convenient. And so it's very easy to slide into these types of decisions rather than decide. And then that ends up in a very inequitable distribution of tasks. And so one of the tools that I recommend that I think is very powerful is the set of cards from E. Rodsky. It's called Fair Play, and these are a set of 100 tasks that are required to manage a household and children, if that's part of the household. And the goal is to look through the 100 cards. They're both one-time tasks, like annual tasks, like doing taxes, and also all the way to daily tasks like packing lunches for the kids. And you look through these 100 cards, you discard the ones that are not relevant for you or you decide that you don't want to take on as a family. So if you don't care about thank you notes, great. Discard the thank you note card. Nobody needs to own that. But then with the remaining cards, you have a conversation about how you want to divide those cards in a way that just makes transparent and visible all of the different tasks involved, and you are able to divide it in an equitable way. And if your partner is not yet up for this game, you can start with a smaller set of discussions. But the key is to choose guilt over resentment. So you might say, "Oh, I feel guilty asking my partner to do all these things. They're working a lot, they're traveling." That might be uncomfortable for you to feel guilt, but choosing resentment where you don't say anything and you just sort of build up a frustration over time is actually toxic for relationships.
How influential are gender norms in how people tend to assign housework?
They're very powerful. And certainly what you saw modeled in your own family starts to shape your own mental models of how housework should be divided, as well as what society expects. So I'll give you an example. In our family, we decided that my husband would own the card for medical and dental work for our kids. And so, this started when we had our first son, who's now 12. After the initial newborn appointments, he would be the one to take him to his pediatrician visits. And yet the doctors would always call me to remind me and to tell me, make sure you're going to bring in your son on this date. And I would say, "Oh, that's great. Could you actually call my husband? He's the other name listed on the contact form and the one who's going to be there with him." So you'd have to sort of train society that you're going to be doing things differently sometimes. But again, the important thing is to make a deliberate choice that works for your family as opposed to defaulting to what is expected or what you saw modeled.
Do you have thoughts on the best approach for couples to actually take in dividing up housework?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fair play cards are great. The idea of um, re-examining on a periodic basis is also important because things change, circumstances change. There was a period of time, for example, when I was writing the book and working full time in my corporate job, and my husband and I had a deliberate conversation before I took on the task of writing the book. And I said, "Look, for this next year, when I'm deep in research and manuscript writing, I'm not going to be able to do as many things related to the kids and running the household. And that means will need you to pick up some of that slack. Are you comfortable with that? Is that okay with you? And so kind of pre-checking in when you know a big change is coming or when you know there's going to be a season that's going to be bonkers for you. And then, kind of addressing that proactively as opposed to letting that resentment build up is also a best practice.
When does it make sense to outsource house stuff?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of outsourcing, and we definitely outsource a lot. What is interesting is we had, and I think a lot of people look at their salaries, particularly when it comes to outsourcing for childcare, and they say, oh, in a different sex couple, a heterosexual couple, I often hear women say, my salary was not even going to cover the childcare, so we just decided I would stay home for the first, few years. Well, I hate that math because really it's not just coming out of one person's salary. The childcare comes out of both people's salary in a marriage. And there's an opportunity cost for being out of the workforce, and it might be very challenging to get back in. So I think you need to think about certain things of certain outsourcing tasks as investments, particularly childcare. That's an investment in your future career. You're not always going to pay such a steep rate for particularly newborn care that does decrease over time. And then there's also, and so sometimes it makes sense to outsource because of an investment perspective, but there also might be decisions where it's a domino effect. And if you decide, for example, my parents moved into a senior community where they actually don't have to manage the lawn care, all the things that you do in a single family home. And that was partly because even, managing the outsourcing of it was getting to be a challenge. So there are, when you decide, okay, outsourcing is something that we need because of our busy lives, think about one bigger decision you could make that would actually eliminate a lot of that outsourcing as opposed to continuing to outsource everything.
What are the consequences of getting the division of housework wrong?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I would say you can course correct. So sometimes I get the reaction of people who say, I've never had any of these conversations. It's too late for us. And I would say it's not too late. But I think the key is the consequences can be pretty significant. I mean, a divorce, right, as one of the very significant ones, but then also just real degrading of a relationship. And there are studies that show that couples who contribute equally to the household income and to the household responsibilities have lower divorce rates than households where those contributions are less equitable. So it's very, again, if you look at the research, it makes a rational sense to be talking about the contributions regularly because as people change jobs, as kids' ages change, as there are other things that shift, it's something that you want to regularly revisit and not just assume because we had this conversation once and we made, one set of decisions that is going to endure for the rest of your time with someone.
Really interesting. What are the main decision points people should think about when they're deciding where to live, like physically where to live?
Yeah. So in terms of certainly the framework can be helpful, but I think, it's helpful to think about things such as family help. So this is something that there's been a lot of research around the difference between, the early child years of any parent's life are tough. There's just a lot of demands, particularly if you're continuing to have a full-time career while you're bringing up children. And the difference between people feeling, yes, this is intense, but I can handle it, and, this is really breaking me, is how much help that they have, including especially from family. So I think that that's something that's been a trend where we're seeing people, whereas the norm was to, move wherever the opportunities were for your career. Now, I think there's a trend that we're seeing of people thinking through, well, actually, if we both want to continue to work, which in a lot of major cities, you need two incomes to really make it work, we need to be closer to family. So that's something to think through. Also, kind of what if there are other factors, whether it's for health perspectives, hobbies you really enjoy. Um, there's really interesting research that different parts of the certainly the US, and I imagine this is true for Canada, attract different personality types. Richard
Mm.
Florida has done really interesting research in this area. And so you might think about, the um, places in the country that are best suited for not just your career prospects, but also, the personalities and the activities. And then when it comes to a, preference for city versus suburb, it's really thinking through what are the criteria that are important to you. And we have an exercise in the book to help with this. And then, assigning a prioritization to those criteria, just as you would as you're thinking through any nuanced decision. And then having, again, following the framework, having conversations with people who live there, trying to do some check-ins, and ultimately not just looking at the financial, is this a good investment for us to buy here or to continue to rent here? But how is it going to make me happy, or how is it going to contribute to my well-being on other dimensions, which I think
Mm.
some of us often skip when it comes to those types of decisions.
Yeah, I love that.
How would you suggest that people think about the rent versus own decision?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many different calculators that you can find online right now. One of the things that I think is not discussed enough is kind of your preferences for having autonomy, right? So this idea of having, not being able to make much changes. Like, is it actually really great for you to outsource everything to a landlord? And that, again, is one of those decisions where you don't have to make a lot of sub decisions under that because you have someone else managing it. Or are you going to be somebody who's frustrated when you really want to change the way a certain part of the home looks and you can't because it's not yours? So again, thinking through some of the personality related aspects can be helpful. One of the things I sometimes get asked is, well, what do you think about home renovations, right? There is a trend towards saying, okay, well, you can buy a house and then just, evolve it over time. And one of the things that I think is interesting is, again, personality wise, some of us tend to be more maximizers when it comes to decisions, meaning we're trying to really get the right answer, the best version of whatever it is, whether that's a pair of, black pants, whether that's the perfect fixtures for a bathroom. And some of us are more satisficers, right? We're fine with, whatever pair of pants as long as they fit and are black. Or, if a bathroom works and it lets me do what I need to do there, like I'm good with it. And so we saw this firsthand. My husband and I tend towards the maximizer type. And so we remodeled one bathroom and it nearly killed us because we felt like all the different decisions that we had to make. It was like a second job after we performed our first job during the day. We had a ton of choices to make at night. Whereas my sister-in-law remodeled an entire house as she was working full time, expecting her second child, and she is much more of a satisficer. And so she just made those decisions and moved on. And so that's one of those areas where, you don't necessarily think about that before you undertake a remodel, but it can really significantly impact your well-being.
Oh, yeah. We did a kitchen years ago, and it was so stressful. And then we haven't started yet, but we're going to do another small renovation project in our house. And I found somebody whose work I really like. And I was just like, listen, this is the general idea of what we want to do. I don't want you to ask me for any input. Just do it. Like, I like what you do. Just please don't ask me anything and just do it. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah,
Classic
well, I
Ben.
think it sounds like you made the decision to trust the expert that you hired, and you were going to be okay with whatever they did.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Uh, Coming back to the 5C framework, can we use housing as an example? And can you take us through like how a couple would use the 5Cs to make that housing decision?
Yeah, and I can actually share a personal example because I've used it myself. Both my co-author and I actually used the 5C framework to make decisions about whether to stay or move with different outcomes. So she used it and decided to move twice, actually, since we've written the book.
Hmm.
And I could share my experience, which is pre-COVID, we were in a small footprint home in the center of San Francisco. My husband and I commuted downtown. We had our two young kids in nearby schools, and we had outsourced a lot of the childcare that we were just talking about. And when everything shut down in the pandemic, we found ourselves working remotely from rooms that were not intended to be home offices. Our kids were Zooming in to remote school from our dining room table. They were 4 and 7 at the time. Uh, and so eventually we started, we had a couple of college students who would come in and help them stay on Zoom task while we attempted to do our jobs. And we were all on top of each other all the time. And we thought we just need more space. When we started to clarify, we said we need more space. We need schools that are open. And so then we would communicate with each other. And I would say this conversation had been simmering, the city versus suburbs conversation, for a while. And COVID really turned it up to a boil. And what we learned is that where and when you communicate is just as important, in fact, more important than what you say in that communication. So, for example, we would bring this up as we were brushing our teeth, getting ready for bed at night, right? Not a great time to have conversations about major life decisions. So we started having these conversations on hikes. That was one of the activities that was available to us at the time. And it turns out that when we got away from the stress of being locked down in our house, away from the dirty dishes and the chores that needed to be done, out into the hiking trails, we could think more expansively. Our kids would run ahead, and it was a better conversation. So then we considered the choices, decided on a specific suburb that was close to my dad, and we had some friends there, and we started checking in with realtors, with people who had left the city and moved to that particular suburb. But we also checked in with a published study. And interestingly enough, I was writing the chapter on moving as we were going through this process. And I came across this study in the Journal of Environmental Psychology about the impact of density on well-being and family happiness. So square footage per person, essentially. And you would think that, the more space you have, the better. Well, it turns out there's a point of diminishing returns. And actually, once the home gets too big, like if there's a separate wing for the kids, children, particularly boys, which is what we have, can feel disconnected and lonely. So that was interesting. And then it also turns out that a family's perception of a space is a far bigger indicator on family harmony than the actual physical square space. So as we were complaining about, oh, this place is too small and we're all on top of each other, we were not doing ourselves any favors when it came to our family functioning. So we started to move to the consequences and looked, had some houses we were interested in, we're about to put in some offers, and we did the math, and based on the fact that everyone needed more space at the time, home prices were quite inflated. And also we realized that taking on a bigger mortgage, which we would be doing, would be tethering us more tightly to our corporate salaries. And so when we had that realization, we re-clarified and said, hold on, do we really value more space and open schools, or do we value career flexibility? And we want to actually take advantage of the fact that we had been in our current home for quite a while. We had home equity build up, and that would provide a bit of a financial cushion. And it turned out that we both decided we wanted career flexibility more than more space. And once we made that decision to stay, it turns out we were able to think more creatively about how to get more space and schools that were open. So I decided to rent an office, which is where I'm speaking to you from an office that's a 7-minute walk from my home. And we ended up switching our kids' schools to an independent school that had more flexibility and was able to be open. And that's where they both go today. So this idea of, once you sort of cut off one avenue, which you think is the only way to get what you want, you can have more creative choices that help you have your cake and eat it too. And now, fast forward today, my husband and I both started our own businesses. And so we did get the career flexibility and went to the entrepreneurial path.
Wow. Great story. How should couples think through the division of work and childcare?
Yeah, so this is also one of those conversations that is so much easier to have when it's a theoretical conversation before there's an actual baby that needs to be cared for. So, and I mentioned early on, making it clear whether continuing to work full time is important to you. I, for example, had always thought my mom had paused her career when she had me and my brother, and I thought, and then actually went to work in a part-time capacity. And I thought, oh, part-time work seems like the option of kind of the way to have both. And it turns out that in my co-author's class, I learned about all of the ways that part-time work is actually a great deal for the employer and not such a great deal from the employee perspective in terms of, you often work more hours than you're being compensated for, you don't have as much access to benefits, et cetera. And so I had kind of resolved in that class that I was going to find a way to continue to work full time. And so I had told that to my husband, when we were first dating, and said, this is important to me. I want kids, but I also don't want to have to compromise my career in order to do that. And he agreed that, that was something he was open to. And so, I think getting those conversations out early on to make sure that nobody has assumptions about, do you want kids? First of all, do you want to continue in your career? What does that mean in terms of our budget needs then? Because childcare is quite expensive, particularly in the US. And then talking about other, if you assume that your parents are going to help you care for your child, have you actually talked to them about it, right? I think sometimes people make assumptions of, oh, my mom is going to love caring for her grandchildren. Well, check in with her about it, because that might be like, I'd love to come visit and, hang out with them for a couple hours on a weekend, as opposed to, I would like to be your nanny. So those are, again, important conversations to navigate ahead of time.
Yeah, that's really interesting. My parents did that for my sister, who has a young child. They're just now ending their nanny duty, and I think they're super excited to do it. But I know now that it's come to an end, they're kind of like, whew, that was intense.
Happy to go back to seeing them less regularly.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned this earlier. How common is it for someone who decides to be a stay-at-home parent to successfully return to a career later?
Yeah, I mean, the data is mixed on it. It definitely, a lot of factors help to ease those ramps back into the workplace. So the ability of someone to keep their skills and their network warm during the time that they're away is really critical. If they have a license, say they're a professional that has gone through a licensing program, continue to keep that license active so there's not a re-licensing effort that needs to happen is also important. So one of the things that if you do decide to take a career pause is to go into that intentionally and say, I'm making this decision for this period of time, but I know this is not forever. And I think the challenges that we see are when people, again, slide into the arrangement as a gradual thing, or maybe they got laid off right before, they think that we're actually seeing, unfortunately, a trend towards with all the layoffs that are happening, people getting laid off on parental leave. They are realizing, okay, well, I thought I would have a job, but I'm not working right now, so I'm maybe I'll stay home with this child. And then not having put those steps proactively in place to think about how am I going to keep my skills and network sharp, then it is much more challenging to get back into the workplace afterwards. So like all of these decisions, the key is don't slide, decide.
How would the 5C framework apply to deciding whether to end a marriage?
Yeah, so I was just at an event speaking with a fellow panelist who is a divorce attorney, and the second C of communication is really the key. So if you have tried to have a lot of conversations with your partner who has there have been issues. You have tried couples therapy, you've tried to, rely on trusted experts, and you're really not able to move past some of these insurmountable challenges. The key to clarify is how to separate while still maintaining a collegial relationship, right? Because I think the hardest parts, particularly when there are children are involved, is when the conflict becomes so large and toxic that it really has a negative effect on the entire unit. And so my co-author went through a divorce with her first husband, and she talked about how, it was very helpful when she clarified. The 5 Cs didn't exist at the time, but we developed it together as part of our research. But she said the biggest help for her was to clarify that what was important to her was to maintain a positive relationship with her ex-husband so that the kids would not have negative outcomes from that divorce. And she eventually remarried, and her new husband and ex-husband actually knew each other. And her new husband, second husband, proposed, "What do you think about having her ex," and he had remarried at that point, "over for Thanksgiving, so our kids wouldn't have to go to two houses, to two different Thanksgiving experiences?" And she said, "That's interesting. Ask me again in 5 years." So again, 5 years later, he asked her, and she said, "Okay, at this point, I'm open to it." And so now he's since passed away, but for many years, they hosted a joint Thanksgiving experience. And so their children were able to have that, still have, all families involved. And so again, that point of clarifying what was important to you, which I think once you do that, it makes all the other C's move more smoothly, because it is your North Star that you're sort of using as a guide to solve for the situation. So that's an example of how having clarity about what's the priority in that experience. It's not to say divorce isn't incredibly hard and painful, but that it can have a positive outcome for children when you have that type of clarity.
Yeah, it sounds like a really smart solution. How does divorce affect children more generally?
Yeah, so I mean, that studies show that what really is the linchpin is the amount of conflict in the divorce. And so, when you're able to work through the issues and set up a arrangement that where the kids are having as much stability as possible, that does not have a negative effect on the children. And so we've seen creative solutions such as parents, often, one person is moving out of the home to a new home. We've seen creative solutions where the existing family home becomes the place where different parents move into. So the kids are, continue to stay in the home. One parent has another, each parent has a separate place that they're then moving into during the weeks that they're not parenting the kids. And obviously that takes a lot of resources, so it's not an option for everyone. But it is, there are, again, when you think about the choices, there are choices that help get you closer to having what is needed for essentially, children to maintain their stability after a family rift like a divorce.
How has the concept of retirement changed over time?
Yeah, it's changed a lot, and it's still changing. So as longevity has gotten longer and longer, so that the demographers estimate that the average baby born today in an industrialized nation has a 50% chance likelihood of living to 100. So when you think about that, you think about that our traditional retirement age is 65, the math doesn't math to just be educated for the first, third of your life, work for a third of your life, and then be retired. So, you will end up having to pay for a very long retirement, with that type of arrangement. So this idea of having periods of time where you're kind of dialing up and dialing down the amount of autonomy that you have in your life, as opposed to just flipping a light switch off, of your career at a certain age, is becoming, more of the norm. And so you've seen, perhaps this idea of mini retirements in the news, where millennials or even younger people are saying, rather, I'm not going to delay retirement to 65. I'm actually going to take a couple years and, do some things that I might not be able to do when I'm older from a physical perspective. And I'm going to plan for that financially. And I'm going to, treat retirement not as one thing that I do at the very end of my life, but that's something I intersperse into my life. And I'm as planful because I want to work longer. I'm going to have to work longer to finance it, but I don't want it to be just a sprint that I'm, working until one day I then suddenly have the entire day available to go be quote unquote retired.
In light of the changing nature of retirement, how important is it for adult children to discuss their parents' retirement plans with them?
I think it's really important. I mean, and it's certainly important for you to discuss not just retirement plans, but plans for how they want to be cared for when they can no longer care for themselves. Lots of things that are really uncomfortable, right? We don't like to think about endings. We don't like to think about death in our society. But these are really important conversations to have, again, while it's still theoretical, while it's still, you're not sitting in an emergency room being like, has anyone talked to mom about, what she wanted in terms of her care? This is something, unfortunately, that my family had to do because we didn't have any of those conversations. And then when my mom had a serious accident that left her in the ICU, and we realized, we should have had a lot of these conversations earlier. It actually happened on the last day that was supposed to be her last day of job before she retired. So it's just, life is very ironic sometimes. So, I like to say, especially if you're working with a financial advisor, if you're working on something for yourself, like your estate plan, for example, it's a great time to approach your parents and to say, hey, we're starting to think through some of these questions for ourselves around, our retirement planning, around, how we want to be cared for when we can no longer care for ourselves. And I realize we've never had these conversations. Can you help me understand how you approach these topics, the things that you've set in place? So that can be a good way into the conversation. But there's also a lot of data on how dementia and some of these degenerative diseases can be diagnosed up to 7 years earlier based on activity in bank accounts as opposed to by a doctor. So if you start to see things like double credit card payments, missed credit card payments, there's an impact on credit scores, that can be a warning and an indicator that there might be some concerning neurological issues before, again, it gets to a point where they're giving an official diagnosis by the doctor. So these are really helpful conversations to have because they can raise issues that you might not know about for many years.
How involved should the adult children be in their parents' retirement financial planning?
Well, it really depends on a lot of factors, right? I think an important conversation to have is, how the parents want to care for themselves when they can no longer support themselves and care for themselves. And then, whether they can pay for that and how, if they anticipate needing any financial support. So depending on your family's situation, your parents might say, yes, we've thought about that. We want to stay in our home as long as possible, and we've set aside funds in order to do that. So great. Other families might be in a very different situation, in which case the children will have to be very involved, not only in their financial planning, but in actually providing support, right? And so you're the sandwich generation where you're paying for childcare as well as contributing to your parents being able to have care for themselves is very real. As we are in this silver tsunami of more people turning 65 every day than ever, we're certainly going to begin to see more situations where people are supporting both their children and their parents. So I think it's very critical to have the conversation to understand what you're working with so that you can start to take steps to understand how involved you'll need to be.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Rather than it being a surprise and you're like, oh, the adult child doesn't have it factored into their own financial plan, and all of a sudden they have to provide support unexpectedly. That could be very stressful.
Absolutely. And I know it's one of these things where the conversation is so uncomfortable, and I've had it myself in less than ideal circumstances. And let me tell you that it is so much better to have it proactively when it's just a hypothetical than when it is a necessary situation.
Yeah, it's interesting. The point about cognitive decline is really interesting too. Here in Canada, we by our regulatory body are required. I can't remember if it's encouraged or required. I should know definitively. But anyway, it's something that we assign to client accounts is something called a trusted contact person, a TCP. And it's basically, if we see signs of cognitive decline, then it's a person who we can contact. So the client gives us permission ahead of time to contact this person, just to say like, hey, this person who you're the trusted contact person for is exhibiting these behaviors. We just want to let you know. So we've definitely seen cases where, kind of like you described, in the client's financial accounts, we'll see something that just doesn't quite look right, and then we'll speak to an adult child or another relative that they trust. And in a lot of cases, it has come back where it's like, well, they have actually have been struggling. So thanks for letting us know. But yeah, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think it's not talked about enough
Yeah,
because, yeah, I think this is certainly, especially with so many ways that seniors are unfortunately susceptible to fraud as well, and to phishing attempts, and all the ways that I think um, our devices let people in when they shouldn't. That's certainly something that is another trigger for the concern. So it's great that that is a requirement potentially. And I know there are services that are set in place. One is called Careful, that is able to provide that monitoring as well.
yeah, makes a lot of sense. Everything flows through financial accounts. It's yeah. Okay, so we've talked about all these money and love decisions. Uh, how should people apply this kind of thinking to finding the right partner in the first place?
Yeah. So a question that I get sometimes is like, aren't you taking the romance out of it if you're telling me to like apply a framework to thinking of, about my future partner? And I don't think it takes the romance out of it. I mean, I definitely think there's room for romance, but given that the person who you marry or decide to spend your life with is, the biggest career decision you make, it's a huge financial decision. It definitely should be a decision that you go into with some planfulness and rational thought instead of just, letting your heart lead you. So I think, thinking through, first of all, and I also do not believe that there's only one person out there for anyone. So I think, letting go of that, impossible standard of finding the one person is really important. And there's some really interesting research when it comes to choices because well, let me back up. So, thinking about using the framework, clarifying what is important to you, and again, not just the laundry list or my co-author likes to say, don't think about your potential partner as if you're ordering a pizza of like, I want olives, I want pepperoni, I want, right? It's like you're not might not find, your wish list in one person, but clarify, what are those values that you have that are really important to you that someone else share. Certainly communicating, right? Having those conversations with a potential partner to see if you're on the same page instead of, waiting to see how the relationship goes before you broach them. Like that should be an indicator of, how well the relationship is going is, are you able to talk about these tough things? Are you able to have these uncomfortable conversations in a way that actually helps you feel more connected as opposed to, makes it seem like this is an insurmountable object or we can't, have this conversation. And then when it comes to choices, there's really interesting research by a professor named Baba Shiv out of Stanford who looked at the effects of sequential choice. So if you think about dating apps, right, it's lots of sequential choice. Like there's endless people who you can swipe and continue to, see more, other options versus simultaneous choice. So he has an arranged marriage. And so when he was growing up in India, and said, I'm ready to get married, his parents went out and found three potential partners for him. He met each of those three partners, uh, told his parents which one was his first choice. Each of his potential partners told their parents. And, fortunately for him, his first choice was also her first choice. And so they married. And so it got him thinking about, are people who what are the effects of having a simultaneous choice? And it turns out people who choose between simultaneous options have more satisfying experiences, not just in the dating realm, but when it comes to you know deciding what to have for lunch. And if you always think there's like a next great option around the corner, then you're going to be hungry forever, right? So thinking about using that research to guide you. Checking in, with couples who have endured long relationships in a positive way that you admire, and ask them, how did you think about deciding to get together? Or what are the things that you attribute your long-standing relationship to, right? Having that, perspective from with people you admire is helpful. And then, exploring the likely consequences dating is a way of forecasting, right? Dating is a way of saying, I'm trying before I buy. I want to stress test this relationship. So let's go on a trip together. Let's, put ourselves in a stressful situation so we can start to see how we might do under pressure when we're not in the, honeymoon phase, or when we have to face something that's really challenging. And so, making sure you're not just together under ideal circumstances all the time, but that you're actually modeling what it might be to be in a challenging situation.
How should people decide when a relationship is serious?
Well, I think that is um, a subjective term. I think being able to have these conversations, if you think that this is someone that you want to see, you're excited about, you want to take the relationship to the next level, then have these conversations with them. I think that, certainly if it's somebody you want to introduce to your parents, or, to other important people to you, if it's somebody you want to travel with, like these are then the indicators that would say, okay, well, try to have a conversation about money and see how that goes. Try to have a conversation about, you know, children. And again, it doesn't have to be like sitting down and saying, okay, so how many kids do you want? But, I remember a conversation very early on that my husband and I had, where I was raised Jewish, and I knew that that was important to me to raise my children Jewish. He was raised with one parent who was Jewish, one parent who was Catholic or Protestant, and sort of both and neither. And so we had a conversation over dinner, like we were just dating. Kids were light years away from either of our minds. And I said something about, it's important to me to raise my kids Jewish. And, I always imagined that I would do that. And he said, yeah, like I'm open to that. My parent family celebrated Christmas and Hanukkah and everything, and I felt like I didn't really have a specific religion. So I like the idea of having, kids who have a strong identity. That works for me. And I remember being like, whew, okay, I think we just like can't check that item off the list, even though this wasn't something that was, imminent for either of us, but it was, we're able to talk about how we might want to handle that in a way when it still felt like we were kind of fantasizing about it.
Hmm. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. What about marriage? So it's like taking a relationship seriously. How should couples decide to take, I guess, that next step and actually get married?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is a really big step. There are lots of financial considerations that certainly in a long-term marriage, when more than 10 years, there are real requirements around. So it's not a step people should take lightly. The data show that people are waiting longer to get married. It means they have more assets and often more debt when they get married. And so having a conversation where you are really transparent with your finances is really crucial if that's something that you're planning to do. My co-author and I really encourage people, even if they're not planning to get a prenuptial agreement, to do the type of revealing that is required in order to get a prenup, because that really sparks really helpful conversations, and again can breed more trust and intimacy. I think a lot of people have this concern that, again, if they have these conversations, they're going to lead to conflict. But actually, my co-author's second husband was a psychiatrist, and he had this great term, which is intimacy is into me see, meaning you're asking someone to look into your deepest, darkest, innermost hopes, concerns, fears. Often those are all linked to money, right? And so to be able to talk about those things with each other before you walk down the aisle, or as a way to determine if this is somebody you want to walk down the aisle with, is a really helpful step.
And the last one on kind of the framework thinking. What about kids? Like marriage is a big decision. Kids are maybe probably a bigger decision. How should couples think through that one?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many aspects to it, and they're very tied to career, to money, to
Mm.
family, to home, all the other pieces. So, if it's one of these things where there are actual biological realities, where you cannot just put off this decision indefinitely.
Mm.
And so, I remember looking at a chart that my doctor showed me that showed, an age on one axis and level of complications on another axis, right? And as your age increases, so do, unfortunately, a lot of the complications and developmental differences that can happen in pregnancy. And so it was an area that my husband and I were kind of like kicking the can down the road on. We had like a rolling 2-year plan, and then got to 2 years, and we're like, well, we're not ready for kids. And it's the thing is that you're never going to feel ready for any of these big things: marriage, kids. I remember, looking at a house for the first time. We didn't feel ready to buy a house, but the research shows that things that people regret are not the risks that they did take, but often the risks that they didn't take, right? And so not being bold, the research is that happiness dips for parents pretty quickly, and then kind of as a gradual climb back up. But it's really about purpose and meaning, and the people who are, and parents have a real high dose of that. And so if it's something that you think that you want to do, starting to embark on that journey sooner rather than later can be really beneficial. But it also, and so actually some of the people who have used the framework and have told me it's been so helpful for them is same-sex couples, because they know that it's going to be, a bigger investment, more work for them, more effort. And so they want to make sure that they're going in, again, as deliberately as possible into that journey. And so they both have gone through the framework. I would say this is an area where you actually might want to do it separately and then come together and talk about, certainly have the conversations, but then to talk about if you want to do it, but then go do your own research, go talk to people who have, decided to have children, not decided to have children, and then come back and talk about the results, because you need to both be on the same page about wanting it.
That's a really interesting idea to do it separately. Okay, so you co-authored this book. As you've given us a ton of your own examples, you've lived a lot of these decisions. What were your biggest learnings working with your co-author in writing this book?
Well, she is just a wonderful person. I say she's a national treasure because she is just turned 84 and is now, her second husband actually passed away while we were waiting for the book to be published. And she did move again. She moved into a retirement community, and someone introduced her to a widower who was moving into that same community, and they have a wonderful relationship now. And they just went through the process of getting a joint credit card. So money and love conversations can happen at any age, is what she has taught me. Another learning that I've had from her is, so our chapter on the senior years at the end of the book was originally titled The Golden Years. And I remember when we were submitting the manuscript, she said, this title doesn't work for me because these are hard years. She at that time was the full-time caregiver for her second husband who had Parkinson's. She was also witnessing a lot of her friends and peers getting sick, passing away. She said, I go to a funeral every other week, it seems like. This isn't the golden years. You're in the golden years. You have young kids. Your friends are healthy. You can pick up and go on a trip together without someone saying, they can't go because they just had this new diagnosis. You're in the golden years. And so frankly, that plus a lot of other things in my life helped me clarify the fact that I wanted to pull forward this idea of radical autonomy for myself and be more present for my kids when they're in a tricky middle school age, when I'm still as physically healthy as I can be. And so I think working with her has given me a lot of insight, and I really attribute that to her wisdom and the perspective that intergenerational relationships can offer.